off as contradictions. We are here to play in that realm of contradiction and cognitive dissonance. We are here to infect your mind.
Happy New Year.
That's right. It is the first one of 2024. I struggled to think of a name for the type of I guess, for lack of better terms, the social role of the people that we were examining for this episode. And I don't know about any of the people that you picked. I kind of intentionally wanted it to be a surprise so we could kind of each have our moment in the limelight, explaining who we picked, why we picked them, and in taking the fore in that. And so I don't know about your peoples, but my peoples, I think the best single word to describe the role that they fit in the times that they fit in is mystic.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't want to say holy man, because that's not necessarily true, but it kind of is. They all participated in some form or other of leading some kind of religious sect, but they were also politicians and policy leaders and social critics, and I don't know, it was tricky, and I settled on mystics like 20 minutes ago as I was sitting down trying to finalize some stuff.
Yeah, I was periodically using like spiritual leader and shaman, but I would say I kept qualifying it with like the shaman archetype, because I think I was experiencing the same thing, that there's not a clear word for a leader who is leading through some type of special connection that they have with something that other people don't. And then in some cases, it's not even that. It's tough to kind of parse why this person is in charge, or that they even are in charge. Sometimes it's a little obscured, the amount of power they actually have. Situation by situation, obviously, you can kind of get an idea of what each person is, but there is a clear archetype, but I just don't know the word.
Yeah, and
or
that's something.
Is there clear? Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Maybe whatever viewers we might happen to have that are regulars, if we even have regulars, can help us out with that. I think mystic is close. Shaman, that was one that kept coming to the front of my mind, but it's not everyone on my list was one of those people that was like dedicated to leading others through their spiritual understandings to an awakening type of thing.
By other worry, I actually don't know the origin of shaman, so it might already have a very specific definition. Just realized I'd never like Merriam-Webstered it.
I'm operating under the popular idea of that, the person that guides the ceremony.
Yes.
That helps lead people to the state of higher consciousness, or whatever terms that they want to use. Nirvana, whatever terms they want to use. I had to resist going down a couple really intense rabbit holes while looking at some of the details of the people that I chose, because in order to understand some of the details of the people that I chose, I had to go and dabble in surface level knowledge of some of their beliefs. And I know you know as well as I do, once you dive into like cracking open a belief system, it's hard to just, well, that's what it means, and then you close the book. Especially with these mystic men, one of the few overarching traits that I found in all of my surveyed historical figures has been that two things. They had an utter belief that they were chosen to do something, and that there was... I have balloons on my screen. I don't know why.
I didn't do that.
I'm wondering if it's like a visual cue or something.
Yeah.
Right? Because I did this last time and I got confetti. So see, there's the confetti.
Whoa!
Okay. For our viewers that are listening, I apologize for getting distracted, but
Doesn't work for me.
we think we figured out how to make cues in the camera to have things happen in the Skype screen.
That's awesome. I've only heard of that because I don't have an iPhone, and that is pretty much iPhone technology.
Yeah, that was weird. But no, back to what I was saying before I was so politely interrupted. The two things that they had in common is an utter and incorruptible belief that they were destined for something, to either lead people through, or that they weren't going to be one of the masses. They had a destiny that they were important, maybe the important thing in some capacity. And there was access to carefully guarded sacred knowledge and levels of commitment. I don't know what there's a technical term for it, where it's like a belief system that has the different tiers. You start at the lower level entry, and then you work your way up to the next order, and then you're part of the second order, and then the highest order. They all seem to have some kind of tier system like that.
That's interesting. The one person that I focused on was more legitimate, in that, like, the way they operated was like academia, and so they would train people and then let them into the world. And then those people would train people. So you would have people who were, once or twice removed from the original person doing the same thing, which is usually, I do think usually there is more of a like gatekeeping where no, only I can teach this. You can't teach this. And they don't usually pick, let people go and preach their ideas, because that's kind of the only thing that they have. But this person did make a lot of money, so that might be why he was like, fine, I have this market cornered, so you can go somewhere else.
I have 4 people, and I have decent detailed information on 2 of them. And then I have 2 people that we don't know a whole lot about, but I wanted to kind of go back and pick examples of the earliest form of this archetype that we're trying to build. Rather than just get stuck in like 19th century Victorian era occult madness or something like that. Right.
Right.
So the first one, I don't know if I should go in chronological in the order that I looked at them, or chronological in history. I think I'm going to go chronological in history. The earliest one that I have is Imhotep. He was an Egyptian cleric. He was the high priest of Ra at Heliopolis. and he was the chancellor to the pharaoh Djoser. For anybody that knows anything about Egyptian history, the Step Pyramid of Djoser is the precursor to the Great Pyramids of Giza. It was one of the first standalone pyramid tomb structures, and taking into consideration the way that it's built and it preceding the Great Pyramids, it is currently the oldest standalone megalithic stone structure in human history right now. Because he lived approximately 2650 BC, so the better part of 4,500 years ago, we know almost nothing about him. And even the stuff that we do have is conjecture. But what we do know, because one thing about the Egyptians, at least the scribe class, they were prolific about writing down their sacred texts. Starting about 1,000 years after his death, a cult arose around him as a figure, and he's one of the only few non-royal, non-pharaonic Egyptians to achieve some sort of deification or apotheosis in the Egyptian pantheon and mysticism. He merged with the god Thoth, which is the god of medicine, healing, architecture, math, and the patron of the scribes. Some of those will have carryover with the other people that I looked at. And all of them will have carryover in some capacity or at some point. But one of the biggest things of interest that I found out about him was that, other than his deification, because in the system of the Egyptians, it took a lot. You had to be the special person within 500 years on the front side and back side of your lifetime, and not part of the royal family in order to be considered for deification. There's an inscription from a tomb that was dated to about 1350 BC. And well, I'm going to read the quote, and then I'm going to tell you what I was thinking about with it. And then I don't know if I have any ideas on what it necessarily means, but I think it's interesting. The inscription goes thusly, quote, "The web priest may give offerings to your ka," by ka they mean soul. "The wab priests may stretch to you their arms with libations on the soil, as it is done for Imhotep with the remains of the water bowl," end quote. When I read that, all I could think of is that's like the first instance in human history of pour one out for the homies.
Oh, I'm glad you sort of translated the spirit of that.
Right. So the pour out with libations as the remainder of the water bowl. It sounds to me like they're talking that there was a tradition in the cult of Imhotep where the last swig, the dregs, the remainder of the water, the beer, the wine, whatever happened to be in the water bowl would be poured out in reverence, right? To be, the web priest may stretch to you their arms with libations on the soil, meaning pour out from the water bowl, right? And it's like, we still do that. Maybe not in a as religiosity of a manner, or maybe with not, let me use proper grammar here, maybe not with the same religiosity, but there is that idea that giving up something important in honor of the sacred. I wouldn't necessarily go so far to say sacrifice, but I think it's kind of in the same spirit.
Yeah, like it is something that you would do to honor someone, but it is a very small amount. Yeah, I don't think it would count as a sacrifice because you're not really losing anything besides maybe it was a big deal.
And it's something important. I mean, you have to keep in mind that for most of human history, necessities for life were not guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take something, or rather, let me put it this way, surplus is a more modern invention in a lot of ways. I know there's going to be some historians that argue with me, like the whole reason that we have the classical Greek age with the philosophers of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates is because Greece had managed to create an entrenched trade system to have a surplus. They could afford to have a decent number of their population not engaged in sustenance, creation, farming, and trade because they had enough. But even then,
they probably still had 3 togas for their lifetime, like clothing and these types of things, housing.
Right. And you take something like water, which if you don't have it, you die, and you willingly pour some on the ground, not to grow something, not to drink it to sustain yourself or anything like that, as a waste. Even if it's minuscule amount, it's still that symbolism of gifting something of import to something else that's important.
Maybe also a flex, like I don't need to completely finish this bowl of water or this bottle of wine. I can afford to leave a little out as sort of like a thank you. I'm not struggling. I can do this, and I'm going to honor this person by, wasting a little bit.
And I think that interpretation hinges on intent.
Mm-hmm.
You can looking at it from the point of view of a well-to-do person, it can be a thanks because I am so well-to-do, because I can afford to give this extra.
Right.
If you look at it from the point of view of someone that doesn't have that extra, then, that changes that perspective to more of a what are the words I'm looking for? I'll give you what I can. This is for you. Mm-hmm. There's that idea of hope embedded in it, that sacrifice is going to get repaid.
Right.
And that could spark a whole nother conversation about the nature of charity. But I think we'll go into that later. Do you want me to go on to number 2, or do you want to bring yours up for a little bit?
I had just one more question, and then I'd love to hear your number 2. Was the quote that you shared saying that I'm going to do like what he did and pour out some water, or I'm going to pour out some water for him. I'm kind of misremembering if he's copying the actions or if he's doing that for him.
He is copying the actions of those that do that for reverence for Imhotep, and copying that action for reverence for whomever's tomb this was carved on.
Okay, so people got it. Okay, that's
right. It would be like saying that I would kneel before the cross for you the way that the Christians do the cross for Jesus.
I see. Kind of
mimicking
analogy.
that, mimicking that holy symbolism in reverence for this person the way that they revere that person.
Right. Okay. It sounds like his ideology as well was working with the current ideology when died versus something being something completely new.
And one of the reasons why I chose him is because I knew from my prior knowledge that he wasn't the head of state.
Right.
But
sounds like he was just really good at his job.
And he was the primary influencer of the head of state.
Okay, I see. His right hand.
He took his specialization in that sacred knowledge and applied it to influencing, for lack of better terms, influencing public policy.
Yeah, I think that's a great example because a lot of times the spiritual right hand is villainized, especially like in like contemporary media. It's like a trope that they're manipulating the king, or they're acting in their own interest through the monarch. Or so I like that appears to be a good example. He left a great impression. Sounds like we don't really know exactly what he was like, but it sounds like he was generally a force for good, which it can be, looking back at a lot of these like spiritual right hands to a power, you have questions about their ethics and morals.
Right. Because all it takes is, well, let me say it this way. It's part of the reason why the American political system is structured the way that it is, because if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If government were led by angels, then no limits would be necessary. And I always add, neither of those things are true. Therefore, people are fallible, and we need organizational structures to help limit our fallibility towards each other. And those organizational structures are led by fallible people. Therefore, those organizational structures need limits as well, because even the best and most well-intended person is going to bring their own biases and interpretations and perspectives and goals and dreams into making decisions. And those unique perspectives and wants and hopes and dreams and goals are going to massage those decisions into specific ways.
The point of like having to put restraints on people, I guess like an outside actor, someone who isn't technically in charge, isn't necessarily held to those same laws. Like they're not the king. They can't get in trouble for influencing the king.
But they are also...
So there's a power...
And because of their influence, I think they're often viewed with suspicion.
Right.
Because we know that that's how people operate.
Especially when, usually when, like during a presidential election, who the first lady or the first gentleman, I don't know what they call the male version.
It's first gentleman.
Okay. That who they are. I think it would be very stressful if a president got married while in office. You'd be like, who is this person? And we didn't ask for this. So if and they come into power as a group, I think that feels a little less insidious than someone who has had their routine, who they are, you're used to them. And then there's a new dynamic all of a sudden. I can see that garnering a lot of suspicion and negative history.
Right, because... Well, honestly, I don't think especially nowadays, I don't think a single person could become president.
Yes. It would be too many open questions.
Right. And I think part of that is because we look at long-term relationships as signs of psychosocial stability.
Mhm.
If you can be partnered with someone for a decent amount of time and they still like you, then at least somewhere in there you're doing something right. What you're doing right might be total manipulation, or what you're doing right might be you're a reasonable person, you're stable, you can compromise, you can meet in the middle, you can have effective communication that doesn't alienate or ostracize or push somebody out or anything like that. And I think I think that's a big debarring point for candidacy. But zooming out a little bit, that's part of what was so controversial about John F. Kennedy being president and why everyone made a big deal about him being a Catholic president. Because who's in charge of the Catholic Church?
Mm-hmm.
The Pope.
Not him.
Right. And prior to that, it had been Protestant or further presidents where, I mean, the mark of Protestantism is decentralization. There's no single person in charge of the Southern Baptist Church or the Southern Baptist Convention. There's no single person in charge of the Scottish Presbyterian or anything like that. It's decentralized and local, partly for that reason. And there was major concern that United States public policy would be dictated by the Pope telling John F. Kennedy what to do. And I think that's very similar to if someone were to get married during their presidency, it would be scandalous in the same kind of way. There would be the celebrity scandal of so-and-so is dating so-and-so now and blah, 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 all of the petty stuff. But I think a prevailing undercurrent of that would be, how is this person going to implant ideas into leadership in charge of extraordinarily powerful structures?
Right. And I feel like with the Catholic, this person is a different religion than most of America, or not even just like a specific centralized religion. I would wonder how much of that was legitimate fear and how much of that was just prejudice, because that sounds so crazy that the Pope would that. I struggle to imagine in my mind someone genuinely that being a genuine talking point from anyone who was acting in good faith.
And to a degree, I agree. Because if we're going to give benefit of the doubt, and not to stick with our hyper-religious thing, but to give grace where grace is due, then the religious leaders are going to only operate insofar as preserving adherence to doctrine. And more than that would be presumptuous. That being said, there are plenty of examples of for lack of better terms, party politics within religious sects influencing and affecting the secular realms. In fact, that kind of leads me into person number 2 that I have. His name is Deifiacus. there's a couple different ways to pronounce it, and I'm going to butcher it every single way, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Diviciacus. He was written about in Julius Caesar's Gallic War commentaries, and he is the only druid from antiquity that we can name by name, which is pretty phenomenal. And that right there, like, draws my attention to him. He's a Celt, specifically from the Aedui tribe, Aedui, and he was a druid, so obviously a religious leader. Druids were forbidden for writing any of their religious teachings down because it was sacred knowledge, lest that sacred knowledge be taken by non-initiates and then blasphemed or used against them or whatever. So we have no idea what these people believed. We only have conjecture and assumptions written down by the people that knew them and had their own biases about who the Druids were and what they believed. So I'm not even going to speculate on that, other than we know that they were a naturalistic pagan religion. He was also elected as thought I had it written down somewhere. When he was elected as whatever, Uergobretos, Eurgobretos. It's his tribe's version of the magistrate. So he was like the prime minister of his tribe and their key religious leader. In a sense, he was the Celtic version of Julius Caesar at this time. Caesar was the Pontifex Maximus, which is the religious leader of that certain sect in Rome, and a general and a key politician. And that's important because due to population movements and migrations from the Germanic peoples into Gaul, and then those Gallic tribes into southern Gaul, Diviciacus's tribe was being, to put mildly, harassed, and he had beseeched Rome for help, and Rome sent Caesar up there, and Diviciacus was basically the Celtic advisor to Caesar for how to deal with the Germanic and Gallic tribes. So if we're talking about someone that fits that mystic role of having access to that sacred knowledge that no one else has to, as a means to usher people through to spiritual enlightenment, and holding a position where he can influence major policy decisions and geopolitics of the day, this dude fits the bill. Right, he's helping advise Julius Caesar in Caesar's conquest and pacification of Gaul. Those are Caesar's words. At like 4 points in his book, Caesar writes, "Gaul has been pacified," which I think is just phenomenal wording. But doing so in such a way that for the estimated 3 million people that lived in Gaul at the time, by the time Caesar was done with his campaigns, 1 million of them were dead and another 1 million of them were enslaved. So 2/3 of the population were gone. And Diviciacus had a hand in helping Caesar's attention be put on different tribes in different ways. This tribe is dangerous and hostile and a threat. This tribe can be pacified and brought under our control. This tribe is already amenable to us. This tribe, no matter what you do, they're going to hate you forever, right? So he kind of, I'm not going to say he had machinations and was like playing the game of risk and choosing which of his allies or which of his peoples to keep as allies or not. But he was definitely helping make decisions in ways that downstream consequences would.
It sounds like if he wanted to do that and sort of pick enemies to have Rome just bowl them over, he could have. And it also sounds like he kind of betrayed his land. Was he like adversarial to Caesar at all? Or was he like, yeah, go get him? Or I'm sure we don't know, but
Yeah, we don't know a whole lot. His the only mention of him is in Caesar's war commentaries, and then a couple lines written about him mentioned in one of Cicero's books. Cicero's Divinations, I think it is. But this ecosystem that we have in Central and Southern Europe is basically the story of the Roman Empire in Europe since the start to the fall of the Roman Empire. I know we talked a little bit about core and periphery last time and cultural transmission and stuff like that. And this is another example of one of those things where through trade networks and Rome conquering the Italian peninsula and then the Mediterranean and the massive amount of wealth distribution that had. And by wealth distribution, I mean gold, silver, valuable materials, and people in the form of slaves and servants and soldiers, right? That typically what would happen is there was this big buffer zone between the borders of Rome. At this point, it was the Republic, but, the Roman Empire, as we'll call it, between the borders of the Roman Empire and then the non-Romans. And there would typically be that strip of those that were more, quote unquote, civilized and started adopting some of these Roman traits. And then on the other side of them were the more, quote unquote, uncivilized barbarians. In fact, one of the arguments can be made that by giving the people at Rome's borders easier access to things such as food and wine and tools, that civilization process made them less durable and less tough. So the more, quote unquote, uncivilized people that had to, the phrases we would use today, the ones that had to work for a living, right, could just blow through that intermediary zone and prove a real threat to Rome. In fact, that's how the Western Roman Empire fell with the sack of Rome in the 400s, because the Mongols, the Huns had a westward expansion which pushed the Ostrogoths into the Visigoths and pushed the Visigoths into Rome, and it's just really complicated billiard ball series of events. As far as betraying, I don't know about that. From what I know, his tribe was more or less, I'm not going to say allied with, but on better terms with Rome than the other ones were. And so I think it was just a matter of self-preservation. If you were already kind of on good terms with them, and if you could see the writing on the walls, and you see someone like Julius Caesar, who by all accounts, in every firsthand account you can read, even from his enemies, mention how remarkable of a human being he was. That doesn't necessarily mean morally good. That just means remarkable. I don't know. Do what you do to survive. And
right.
That's where
specific people did better, didn't necessarily get genocided or enslaved.
Correct. Now,
okay.
If we think big picture and you want to talk about the potential for ethnic and cultural cleansing, Fast
Well,
forward
they're not
for
here today, so yeah,
right.
it appears that did happen.
Fast forward 400 or 500 years, and you might speak a different tune. But this is something to think about too, though. If we as the United States were faced with a decision today that would benefit us for 100 years and cause no end of problems 300 years from now, how would we make that same decision?
We would, as all people do, usually go with the most immediate consequence and not care about the long-term consequences. There's hundreds of thousands of pages of research supporting that. Yeah. And not like, I mean, depending on how bad, like if you touch that thing, you're going to die, but you're going to have a great time. There comes a point where the long-term consequences do add up enough. But most of the time they do not add up enough.
And then, so two things. And I think I'm going to go in reverse order like I always do because my brain works that way. So point number 2, I think that default setting in human nature is a good thing as much as we look at it as a simple self-preservation, selfishness. And I think that's a good thing because it helps cut down on the ends justify the means mentality or philosophy. Because using the ends to justify the means is a very slippery slope to start morally justifying any number of just absolutely inhumane acts and decisions in the name of a greater good. And I don't think there's a person alive, has lived, or will live that is omnipotent or omniscient enough to be able to make decisions for the greater good and not have it backfire in some just astronomically catastrophic way.
The closest was probably Chernobyl.
Point number 1, I was talking with Mom about this a couple years ago. They had come down to watch a baseball game, William and Orion, something like that. And we were watching William and Orion play on the playground, and we were just talking as parents do. And, I was telling her one parent to another, like, I'm concerned. I see the accelerating pace of change. It's not change. Things are always going to change. It's the accelerating pace of change that I've been seeing in our society globally. And I'm concerned about the type of world that my kids, not the one that they're going to grow up in, because I'm watching them grow up, but the state of the world when they are adults. And I mean, we're already starting to see it. The catchphrase in education for years now has been, how do we educate students to be prepared to solve problems that we don't even know exist yet? Right, the type of jobs that William and Orion are going to have available to them when they're 20 years older haven't even been created yet in some aspects. So how do we prepare them to have a set of tools to troubleshoot and accommodate those jobs when we can't even fathom what those jobs might be or what they're doing? And she said something very interesting to me that was essentially, does a fish recognize that it's in water? And typically the answer is no. While the accelerating pace of change seems terrifying to those of us that have already developed, the type of world that the boys are going to be adults in, they are growing up with it. So yes, it's going to have its own unique set of problems, and I don't know how to effectively prepare them for those problems. But what I do know is, after some reflection on that, what I do know is that they are going to be able to intuitively navigate that social world in ways that I wouldn't be able to help prepare them for anyway, because they're developing alongside it.
I was just thinking just the other day I was having like driving and like just kind of thinking about how probably the most important thing that I learned in college was every ethics course that I had to take, because every decision that I make as like a practitioner every single day in my job has to be ethical, and the actual thing that I'm implementing or telling people to do or suggesting kind of changes as research changes, but ethics never changes. You know, some things are wrong to do, and these are the rules that I have to stay by. And, you know, they change in various random ways, but the spirit is always the same. And I didn't get any ethics classes until I was in a lot of my higher level courses, you know, right towards the end of my bachelor's degree, and one class in my master's degree. And then in my post-master's classes, it would be like a ethics month that you would do for that class, for the ethics of that specific thing. And I'm like, can we teach people that earlier? Because it's really like learning how to be a doctor. Part of that is having the temptation to, you know, take the easy way out, prescribe a medication they probably don't need, and, you know, move on with your day. It'd be easier, but fighting that temptation and doing the right thing anyways. And, you know, as a lawyer, it would be way easier if I could just change this one little evidence. My case would be super easy. I wouldn't have to work as hard, and fighting that temptation because you have to be ethical. And it seems like that is the foundation with which you can adapt to any situation and feel good about it.
Well, and on top of that, too, that goes both ways. It's not just the path of least resistance, human nature. It's also the passionate drive, human nature, too. Recognizing when, as a surgeon, your drive to solve this problem is causing this person more harm than necessary. And to recognize that pursuing this problem as a point of pride is unethical. Right? Or as a lawyer, that winning there's a whole, oh man, what's it called? Have you seen the movie Law Abiding Citizen?
No.
It's a really good movie about a guy has two criminals break in and kill some of his family, and their defense attorney is some award-winning public defender that prides himself on having never lost a case. And he helps the criminals get reduced sentences, get out after a couple years, whatever. And I think that ties in with the ethics that we were talking about, because it goes both ways. You know, as a lawyer, yes, you could fudge evidence to have your client win. You could be so focused on winning that you lose sight of your own moral compass. And this is something I get my students to think about. I have a couple students that are interested in doing, you know, political science as an undergraduate and going pre-law or something like that. And I try and get them to think that, you know, private practice, you have a little bit more leeway because you can kind of, I mean, you want clients and you don't want to be known as someone that turns clients away because word of mouth and now you don't get any clients. But you also get a little bit of freedom with picking who to defend and who not. But especially if you're a public defender, if someone comes to you and the state appoints you to them and they are obviously guilty, can you do your job to represent them in court?
I do think like defense attorneys do have a really bad rap for like helping the bad guy. And I think it's not like, is it wrong to help the bad guy, but this person has this constitutional right that somebody has to do, and kind of taking a step back. Yeah, people give them a really hard time, like any like sensational case or people like getting into true crime will give, the defense attorney like, I can't believe they said that. Like sometimes they do cross the line a little bit and say something that would not be okay to say, like the person deserved it, or like painting the victim in a bad way. And it's like, they're dead. How could you do that? But for the most part, yeah, I mean, it's about staying ethical still. If a defense attorney is unethical, then no, they haven't done their job.
Well, and that ethics piece that I'm bringing up is, could someone in good conscience defend someone that the evidence arrayed against them, I don't want to say proves, because there is a reason why we have the presumption of innocence. Innocent until proven guilty, not guilty until proven innocent, which is true. And to have that, we have to have defense attorneys and legal representation on the defense side. Otherwise, we won't have those protections of innocent until proven guilty. But there are those times, it might be once in a career, depending on where you're at, but there's still going to be that time that your internal moral compass is going to be weighing heavy against you because of the facts of the case and the nature of your job. And, I don't say that to talk my students out of it, but to make sure that they know what they're getting into, that this is going to be a hurdle.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of if I'm going to be a defense attorney, I would have to say to myself, like, the attorney's job is to undermine me, or the prosecutor needs to undermine me. And if they do their job well, it's not my fault that they did a bad job. Or, they had it in the hole, they had all their witnesses, they had evidence, and they didn't, sell the case to the jury or something. It's not on, I would have to tell myself, that's on you guys. You could have and you didn't.
Right. Well, and it goes both ways too. Prosecution. Someone could come to you and give you the sob story, bleeding heart. They're the victim and they need legal recompense in some capacity. And there's not enough evidence presented to even warrant it with litigation.
They just have to say sorry.
Yeah. And, that's kind of like the flip side of this coin, that even the prosecution is going to have these moral dilemmas that they're going to have. And I don't know what the term I'm looking for is. These, forgive the pun, trials of their ethics.
Yeah. The conversation around ethics is that like good people are ethical and bad people are unethical. But I think that the idea that, there's people bad and evil people who purposely get into a field in order to do harm is completely uninformed. And whenever there is like a medical doctor who goes to jail for malpractice or gets sued or something, they didn't go to medical school to rip people off. They did not remain ethical under these circumstances. And whether or not, that we as in academics and everywhere need to talk about how we stay ethical and how the things that you will come up against, and be a little more open about times where your ethics were challenged and what you did about it, versus just pretending like I never get the temptation. I'm always ethical. I was trained to be ethical, and so I am. And having, talking about those challenges a bit more, so that when you're training people, they can be a little more aware of what's actually going to happen.
And even including those instances where in the moment you did what you thought was right per your moral compass and whatever certifying board's code of ethics you operate under, but you have the blessing of hindsight afterwards to reflect and say that wasn't the right decision, for whatever reason. People make mistakes. We're human beings. That's part of the nature of things. And being mature enough to own that, for whatever goods or ills might come along with it, is part of ethics. It's part of being ethical, which leads me to point number 3. And I'm not trying to dominate with my people here, but this guy's perfect for it. I don't know if you've heard of Aleister Crowley. Edward Alexander Crowley, publicly named as one of the most evil people on the planet when he was at his peak by some British newspapers.
What's the word for when, because you named it that thing, it becomes that thing? Like nominal determination or something like that?
Right.
Nominal determinism. So, his name is Aleister Crowley. Of course he was evil. And that's interesting, too, because Aleister's not his name. That's his chosen name. Crowley was his family name. That was his surname. But he was Edward Alexander Crowley. And when he was going to college, he didn't finish any degree programs, but he was a high performer in college. Language, linguistics, and poetry and creative writing were some of his interests and pursuits. And he changed his name publicly because it had a better flow and ring to it. 3 syllables in the first name, 2 syllables in the last name, created that dynamic with the language that he thought had power. Right. And then, that goes that nominal determination that you were talking about. Right. So he kind of like renames himself into this thing because he thinks it sounds more powerful, and as such kind of reinforces that he's supposed to be a powerful being. And I think he nailed it. Nailed it.
Yes. And we could probably do 3 episodes on this dude and not even begin to scratch the surface of who he was and what he was doing. He's a very, very complex, interesting, and controversial character. But where he fits most in our discussion right now is the primary edict for his particular version of Hermetic religious belief. His esoteric religion that he named Thelema. I didn't write it down because I should have, but I didn't write it down. I knew this wasn't going to be a religion and spirituality episode, so I wasn't too terribly concerned about it. But the primary driving force that he wrote down in his book of laws, that he got inspiration from a vision for the speaker of the god Horus, while he was honeymooning in Egypt with his first wife after doing occult magic in their honeyroom hotel, said, "Do what thou wilt." This dude didn't have an ethical boundary. And I don't mean that in the sense of like he was evil or malicious or anything like that, but I mean that in the sense of when the primary doctrine of whatever you want to call his conglomeration and esoteric amalgamation of religion is do what thou wilt. To do what you will, because doing so aligns your individual will with the universal omnispirit will, then all bets are off, right? That you can...
That works very well if only like two people are doing it. If that is widely adopted, we're all in trouble.
Well, and you know, this begs the question, how much of that was and I forget which philosopher said it, but probably Nietzsche, if I had to guess, that all philosophy is just post hoc justification of your own wants, desires, and biases, right? How much of this do what thou wilt is perpetual self-justification, right? Creating an entire worldview and doctrine of religion to justify why you are the way that you are without having to get yourself under control and have discipline. And then how much of it is because he had experiences that thoroughly cemented in his psyche that that type of living was possible and should be endorsed.
That is interesting, like hearing it that way, because now I'm thinking of like the most common like sort of like cultish rhetoric that I hear today is like they're trying to say we're insignificant or we are not insignificant. And what they mean by that is that humans are some sort of special organism put on planet Earth for a specific purpose and reason. And, you know, when biologists are like evolution and the Earth came from this thing and the sun was made during this, it makes them feel insignificant. And that deep insecurity kind of leaks out into, no, I'm not. I'm actually very important. And here's why. And I feel like I can sense a little bit of that insecurity in like, do what thou wilt. Or maybe, the echoes of like Aleister Crowley are still pretty, through our culture. Definitely a sort of touchstone for a lot of niche and I guess cult things. I don't know that everyone knows that what they're being influenced by, which is part of the problem. But I can see how that has persisted.
And I think you touch on something very significant there, because I don't think it's just a little bit. I think it's a lot of it. I think that much like my last person, which I'll save because I want to hear who you picked out too, so we can talk about my last one at the very, very end. But much like the last person that I chose, Aleister Crowley has this sense of he's destined to do something special. And if you look at the dates that he lived, 1860s to, we'll round it up, 1870s to 1940s, what was going on in the world at the time? You had mass industrialization. You had the Franco-Prussian Wars. You had the Russo-Japanese War, which were all kind of like prototypes of World War I. You had World War I, which reminded everybody of the insignificance of human life on the national and global stage. You had World War II. You had the chaotic interwar years where in the aftermath of World War I, all of the quote-unquote civilized, quote-unquote first world countries are trying to grapple with the dehumanizing conditions that they had created for tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. And to find meaning and relevance in all of that, there very much is this, I wouldn't even say it's an undercurrent, I'd say it's a primary current of you have significance, you are special, you are something, and this is why. If you look at by definition, being an esoteric religion, he's going through and he's grabbing all of his favorite parts of all of the different ancient world religions. He went to India, he went to Egypt, he went to Nepal, he went to France. He'd had participated in this Hermetic order. One of the things about him, and I think this is not to psychoanalyze him because I don't know enough about him, nor have I read any monograph or biography on him. This is just an evening's worth of research that I did before this. But it seems like a personality trait for him to thoroughly embed himself in whatever culture he happened to be digesting at the time. He got accepted into this Hermetic order and he tried to take it as far as he could for a couple years. And then he moved to Scotland. And then for like 4 years, you would never see him outside of a kilt. And he wasn't Scottish, right? Wherever he went, he just happened to become enmeshed in that local culture and go all in, right? Almost an OCD compulsive style type of thing, right? And on top of that, most of the branches of the world religions that he combined esoteric style into his religion were of the Hermetic flavor, which in its intricate and infinitely complicated to try and explain, and I don't even understand it fully, so I'm going to improperly explain it, but I'm going to power through anyway for the sake of conversation. The core Hermetic belief is that everything is connected. It's where we get the phrase as above, so below, as below, so above. Like, that's a shortened paraphrase version of what is above is the same as what is below, and what is below is the same as what is above. Essentially, that everything is a part of the three-faced Godhead. And we have a mission to remember that. And by participating in these occult rituals, we can get these glimpses of the memory of what it means to be of the divine. And in doing so, we can transcend to be part of the all again, which is the way that they would phrase it, which the way I understand it is that let me phrase it this way. And I'm not going to try and be too blasphemous with this, but it does fit, and there's kernels of truth here. An all-knowing, ever-present, all-powerful God, what is the only thing that God is lacking in? Limitation. Right. So now here's where I'm going to get blasphemous with it. That's where the story of Christ comes from. By embodying the divine spirit into a mortal shell in a specific point in time, you're taking that unlimited divine essence and you're limiting it, thus completing the cycle. The divine essence can finally understand the only thing it hasn't understood, which is limitation, which in doing so means it can even more fully understand itself and return to being the everything divine. Right?
That sort of validates being human. Right. It validates that you need to be human, and then you can become very special.
Yes, this is just a step in the process. We are trapped in the natural order of things. We are forced to eat, forced to sleep, to be prey to our animalistic urges as this plane of existence to get the higher knowledge, whatever fancy terms they want to use, to transcend and move to the next plane of existence that encompasses the understandings of all of the planes below it.
Right. Yeah, I think the spirit of what Crowley was going for, which is like your thoughts and experiences are valid, they have a deeper meaning, you should continue to explore that meaning, and I think this is a great one because this man has been dead for a very long time, coming up on 100 years, 90 years. And the impact of his philosophy, I'm not sure what you would call it, because he didn't necessarily start a religion, or even, I think he did start a cult, but they all fell apart. He just kept doing it. So there's nothing like that we remember him by, which I think why his name is sort of fallen out, because there's not one thing that you can point to and say like, hey, this guy did that. But the sentiment of a lot of counterculture is the wrong word, but people who feel deeply insecure and turn to these "you are very important" rhetorics to validate their existence. A lot of what they say and how they say it comes from what he said and how he said it.
And a lot of what he said and how he said it came from his interpretations of practices and teachings and doctrines and readings of these lines of thought that go all the way back to Plato and Pythagoras, right? I mean, hell, what's it called? The Corpus Hermeticum is supposed to be written from the perspective of the god Hermes being told by whatever the name of the all-powerful god is in this particular theology, how to bring word to human beings to live life in such a way as to return to being a part of the divine. And I think that's where that "you have worth, you are important, we matter" latches on to people. Because what is the core message of that? The core message of that is you are divine right now. You just have to remember that. And here's how you remember that. Just listen to what I'm saying and do what I'm telling you to do. And that's how you'll remember that you have a piece of the divine in you. And then once you remember that, then that is the key to the next step. We don't know what the next step is yet because we haven't transcended here to get there. But this is how we do.
Yeah, the person who is validating kind of has the power in that relationship, which is where it can get a little insidious. But a lot of times it is, whatever hierarchy of need having personal meaning is, this is a role that we need someone to fill for us, or someone to tell us, or something that you have to learn through life experience and sort of gain implicitly rather than like explicitly being told that, like, why are we here? And having people who can answer that question or can give you some answers to that question in a way that is ethical, net good, is an important role. And I think that ties in great to our whole discussion.
Right. How great would it be if someone could come up to you tomorrow and give you a toolbox ready-made that all you have to do is open the toolbox and follow the instructions, and now you know how to master whatever life is, whatever that means, to become whatever it is that we need to become, to be the best version of you, whatever that means, right? That would be fantastic. I think everybody secretly, irrationally hopes for that, whether we admit it or know it or not. That's why people are gullible, because we want to be persuaded. We want to be gullible. We want to be given these sets of tools that all we have to do is follow the directions and we're good to go. And
I feel like I was thinking of like if like in every Greek myth where they go and talk to the fates and they get their like oracle, they get foretold what's going to happen. And if they all come from a place of anxiety, like what's going to happen? I need to stop this. You've got to help me. And if you approach that toolbox from a sense of curiosity and I've kind of already dealt with that anxiety of like, oh God, why am I here? Is everything meaningless? That is where people can become pretty vulnerable versus someone who is secure, they're satisfied in their day-to-day, and having, I guess you kind of have to already have thought, you have to kind of already know what your meaning is in order to use those tools in a way that won't, Oedipus you on accident.
And I think which is why, as we go farther back in time, now part of this might just be the dilution of historical documents, right? We do have a historical bias because we only have an infinitesimally small piece of the puzzle that survived to us, and we have to extrapolate conclusions out of that. And the farther back in time you go, by definition, then the more inaccurate our conclusions are going to be, no matter how accurately we are concluding, because our body of evidence is smaller and smaller and smaller. The more incomplete your evidence is, by definition, the more inaccurate your conclusions are going to be. But it does seem to me that, and we can look at even tribalistic societies that exist today as a comparison to find some validation in this, that the farther back in time you go, the more people were nested in those social structures that gave them the certainty that they needed to not be derailed psychosocially by whatever happened to be the flavor of the day. Obviously, there were those people that were, there was a cult of Pythagoras, there was a cult of Imhotep, there was a cult of this, there was a cult of that. Within the first 100 years of Christianity, there were more heretic Christian cults than you could shake a stick at, while all these people are trying to find their way, and they find that one person that interprets it in a way that they like because they don't have to do any thinking about it, so they follow through. But on average, I would venture to guess that, and it's not that times were simpler, because people are complex, and we've always been complex, and we're always going to be complex. But I think when you live a more hand-to-mouth lifestyle, a more farm-to-table lifestyle, a more cause and effect lifestyle, then you're constantly reminded of all of those things of what it means to be human. And that helps keep you rooted and grounded a little bit more so than otherwise, which I think is part of why every single tribal society on the planet right now has lower rates of mental health disorders and diagnoses and issues than affluent industrial Western societies.
That did make me think, like, as far as like having an identity and an idea of who you are, that Crowley obviously was not secure or satisfied with being an Englishman. and had to go to other cultures and do other things because he obviously was not very proud of where he came from or his name, and he felt like he had to go and change all of that versus a person. And I feel like we're in a sweet spot today where if you don't travel, you can't travel. You could die on travel, so you don't bother. That you have no choice but to be secure in where you're from, in your name, in your family, in your house, because you don't have that much to compare it to. And we're definitely in the reverse of that, where there is so much to compare it to that everything gets lost. You know, there's a million houses to compare yourself to. There's a million cities to be from and a million teams to root for. And, you could be a fan of a niche cricket team somewhere, or you could be a fan of the biggest, NBA team in America. But you have to be proud and secure of your specific identity, which having too many things to compare it to can help, because you can just push the whole thing away and say, all right, this is whatever. I've seen 1,000 people claim that this is the best thing, and it's 1,000 different things to be. The most important thing is making money. The most important thing is being fit. The most important thing is being smart, and having to force, being secure. I am from Alabama. I live in Portland. Like, this is who I am. And having to, and I've always been a little bit immune to that type of peer pressure, because it has never occurred to me that, this is something I don't relate to, like being ashamed or having like insecurities about your self. That sounds wrong. What I'm getting at is like the feeling inadequate in some way, and having that fuel your habits and the way you dress and the way you talk and the things that you choose to share about yourself. So it seems like Crowley had absolutely no identity or pride with his given identity that he was born into, and so went to all of these other cultures and created a new one for himself, which he was able to travel. It was safe to travel. He was able to go to a lot of different places very quickly, but wasn't hit with so many options that you couldn't decide, and would just sort of throw it all away and say, all right, I'm English. I'm fine with that. I'm not going to find something better because everyone thinks their thing is better.
Well, a couple things on that. He was born to a wealthy family, and his dad died when he was young. 6, 9, somewhere around there. I can't remember. And I'd be willing to guess that had something to do with his, for lack of better terms, we'll call it insecure attachment to self. Right?
Yeah,
he didn't have a secure, right? The same way that we use secure attachments to measure infants. When mother leaves the room, they have their 30-second hesitation, and then they re-baseline and get comfortable with their environment, versus insecure attachment. He had an insecure attachment to self, and as part of that wealthy family he was born into, and his inheritance he got early that allowed him to travel. I wonder, though, and this is, I don't know, kind of where we're getting to as a society. I wonder if having the too much of something, or the too many options, yes, people do tend to reject the plethora when they have too many options. But also at the same time, if you're aware enough given too many options, you start recognizing that they all do the same thing and it's meaningless.
Yeah, that's a good interpretation.
And that's something that I was having a conversation with a student, not in that particular point, but in that vein earlier today. The classroom next to me, first block is sociology, and a couple of the students in there are my former students. And just like AP psychology last year, they come to me to get tutoring, not because their teacher's a bad teacher, but because sometimes people need things said in different ways for them to grasp it. And they're doing a project right now on countercultures. And two of the students that I talked to about it, one of their countercultures was Potterheads, right? The Harry Potter cosplayers. Lives in the
How benign.
And the other one was bronies, the My Little Pony adult male conventions.
Oh my God, they're studying that in school?
Yes, as a means of, because I mean it's intro to sociology, so all of the unspoken implicit social boundaries that we all operate under for what is quote unquote normal, and then
Right.
These organizations that people have created that it becomes acceptable to push those boundaries and push and play with those barriers and make them more organic and malleable. And I mean that's what Comic-Con is, right? That's what the Renaissance Festival is. It gives us these little 1 day, 2 day weekend retreats where we can manipulate the unspoken implicit rules of how people are supposed to behave and act in benign ways. And have, like, I don't know, it's every time I go to Carolina Renaissance Festival, I have that, what a marvelous social experiment this is. And I'm always pleasantly surprised by just the immense diversity of people there. You have people from all backgrounds and all interests. You have jocks. You have you've got jocks, nerds, geeks. You've got black, white, brown, you've got Christian, you've got pagan, you've got atheist, and like none of that matters, and everybody's participating. And it's cheeky and it's fun and it's neat like that. But what I was talking with these students about, because they were, at least with one of them, we started talking about that line between reality and fiction. And how these counterculture groups, oftentimes some of the people get so enmeshed and so embedded in them that line blurs, or where that line is for them is different. Imagine getting into a fight with someone in the lunchroom in high school and you guys are punching each other and he stops and steps back and tries to cast an unforgivable curse at you. Like, the fight stops and everyone just kind of backs up because you're not going to mess with that kid anymore, not because he can beat you up, but because you don't want to get shot or something like that. He's our assumption is going to be that he's unhinged and unstable, when that might not actually be the case. And I got them to sit down and think, like, that's what we do as normal people every single morning. We wake up, we apply our fabricated sense of self to who we think we are. We put on our costume for whatever social role we're adopting for that day, whether it's teacher, and then we dress how we think teachers are supposed to dress based on the unwritten and implied rules on how everyone else thinks that teachers are supposed to dress, or student, or whatever. And then we go out into groups where we have these carefully negotiated but unspoken and unwritten rules for how those different roles are supposed to interact together. The only difference is we're operating under ones that the majority of people can step back and look at and be like, yeah, that's normal. And other ones don't. Like, if I went to school tomorrow and there were 3 or 4 people that were dressed up in full-grown man My Little Pony costumes, like, not judging, do you, but probably weird, you know?
Yeah, that makes me think that we are all consenting. The reason that we are all here in this field for the Renaissance Festival is because we have all consented and assented to do this together. And outside of that context, it doesn't work anymore because no one else agreed to play high fantasy or to, pretend to be ponies. So that is kind of breaking a social contract, where in a festival or convention, the contract is we're all here for this, right? And if you're not here for this, you wouldn't be here. And if you don't like this, you should actually leave because this is what we're doing. And so having, it's like a game. It's like at a soccer field, people play by the rules because they're on the field. And if you started playing by soccer rules in a bar, no one would know what you're talking about. Both completely normal things, but it's the context and the environment and the timing as well. Because going to the convention center the weekend before, dressed up as a pony, gonna get some looks. The weekend of the convention, totally gonna blend in because that's what everyone's there for. So the opportunity to know for a fact that everyone is there for the same reason. This is called X-Con, and I like X, so I'm gonna go, I think is part of the appeal. And the other thing is, I think the diversity that you were talking about is half the point of, like, if someone were to say, I'm going to a sword fighting festival, probably wouldn't be incredibly interested. But having a sword fighting booth in a Renaissance festival works because you need the musicians and the artisans and the people who know how to use a longsword. And that makes it more interesting and broader, which is why more people go, which is why that contract in that game is persisting and has more appeal than just, this is where we're all going to sell rocks in this field. You want to come? Probably not. Would you step into a rock selling booth at a Renaissance festival? Probably. So having,
I like
so some people would go to the rock selling festival, but the mass appeal while still being niche, I think, was the interesting thing that I was caught on, where we're all here for this same thing and we're all going to do it in slightly different ways. And that's also why we're here.
And if you're a person like Aleister Crowley that has a insecure attachment to self, and you start recognizing that from antiquity on, all human beings are doing in groups is playing these games, then who's to say any of the arbitrary rules for any of the arbitrary games are actually enforceable? And that's where you start getting his... Right, you have so many options, you start recognizing that they're all meaningless because they're all interchangeable. And all they are just these social markers that people use to display adherence to this game or that game. And what the game is totally irrelevant. So you can fabricate your own game and take the piece you like from here and the piece you like from there. You start acting out that esotericism. And, having a little bit of self-mutilation, orgical sex magic on this one night to get closer to God, whatever that means, all of a sudden starts making a little bit more sense to you, because nothing matters, because it's all, the Hermeticist would say that it's all an illusion. Everything is one. The distinction between parts is an illusion. We are all the same in kind, but different in degree. The atoms that make up me are no different than the atoms that make up my bed, are no different than the atoms that make up my microphone. We just have these arbitrary labels that we place on them according to this game that we all understand called quantum physics and Newtonian physics, to help us play this game of what we call loosely, quote unquote, objective reality. And once you break down all of those artificial labels and get rid of the stupid game, you can remember that you're the same shit as the stuff next to you. The same thing that makes up you is the same thing that makes up the chair that you're sitting in. There is no distinction between you. Once you get down to the atomic level where you're looking at protons and neutrons and electrons, what's the difference between an electron in your body and an electron in the soil? Nothing, except an arbitrary and artificially placed distinction for us to make sense on this plane of existence of that quote unquote reality.
Yeah, and I think that's where the ethics comes into it again, because do what thou wilt, remaining ethical means cosplay as an Egyptian. Who cares? Stand out in your yard and do your chants. Or like this children's pony show. Or be really obsessed with Harry Potter a long time after it has completed its story arc and its cultural phenomenon. And that there's an element of freedom and joy in those things as well, because I don't necessarily care that there is still a lot of like Harry Potter stuff around, but the books came out a long time ago at this point. And shamelessly doing what you want and being a fan of what you want. And I do think that's valuable.
And finding good in it for you, right? One of the things that one of the students wrote in their essay and made the presentation about was, one of the people that they had a conversation with about it told them that, one of the things they admire most is the courage displayed in the stories, and they hope to try and embody that courage too. And that, started the conversation of like, is Santa Claus real? Well, no. But yet every year, millions of people enact a series of behavior modification with real world consequences. So by virtue of playing this game, changes are made in reality. So is Santa Claus real? Right, I can't cast one of the spells from the Harry Potter books, but if reading the Harry Potter books and me trying to embody some of the virtues and characteristics that I admire out of them helps me be a better person in the real world, is it real? And I think to some degree we have to concede that yes, it is.
Yeah, I think Harry Potter is a good example of that, because there's like obviously a villain and obviously a hero. And if the novel's hero impacts you to be a good person, then that character's effect that they were going for was real, and tangible. And so like, did the person who is Harry Potter that exists only in this novel touch people and change their trajectory for, better, and it's something that they embody, then, we have evidence Harry Potter is real.
Well, yeah, and that's, and because I like to torture my students, I got them to think about, if we're going to be metaphysicians here for a minute, what are the determining factors for whether something is real or not? Does something have to be real in and of itself first, irrespective of whether it has secondary or tertiary real world consequences to be considered real? Or can something be imaginary and then post hoc proclaimed real by virtue of its secondary and tertiary consequences? And I'm not qualified enough to give an answer to that, but it's a good question.
It's a perfect segue into my mystic, because the sort of reason why this story and this person kind of captures me is because they kind of discovered the placebo effect. And technically, some people claim that he discovered hypnosis. He did not. I don't respect this person. I think they're a scam artist, and the person who actually developed hypnosis as a technique comes a little later on. But he was probably the first person to do it, but didn't know what he was doing, if that makes sense. I wouldn't, the first person to get struck by lightning, I wouldn't say discovered electricity. I wouldn't say that this guy discovered hypnosis, but he did do it.
But intuitively capitalized on the power of suggestion?
Absolutely, for financial gain. So the person I have picked is Franz Anton Mesmer, who you have heard his name. If you have heard the phrase mesmerize or mesmerizing, that's where that word comes from, is this man. And he was born in 1734 and died in 1815 and was a contemporary of Mozart in Vienna. And Mozart, obviously, he was very famous from a child, so they were vastly different ages, but they did, go in the same social circles, which I think is interesting and gives you some context for this story. So Mesmer went to the University of Vienna to become a medical doctor. And I think what happened to him is this was a time in the world where any day that you open the newspaper, some fantastic, seemingly impossible, invisible force was being demonstrated. Like a blimp, lighter than air travel, seems completely impossible. But we have this invisible gas that you can't touch or feel or interact with that is having an effect on this ship. And, similarly, electricity was discovered and we were inventing light bulbs. And it's, again, this invisible force that you shouldn't touch, but you also can't see it. You don't know its effect. It's difficult to understand. And so this was a time where people were discovering things that you couldn't see, but could prove were real by their effect. And so I think he got swept up in this and kind of wanted in on the ground floor of his own invisible force. And so he was obviously the University of Vienna is a very accredited university, and graduating from there came with a lot of prestige. And so people really took him at his word, which is why I think he's incredibly unethical and kind of disgraced, because he told people, as a medical doctor, I can help you with your tuberculosis, with his he called it animal magnetism. And he thought that he had discovered that he was a conduit for magnetic forces that influence people's health. And this is incredibly unethical, because if he was just a medicine man or just a mystic and he was doing this, you would say, he's doing what he said on the tin. You're getting a spiritual solution from a spiritual guy. But because he's a medical doctor, people really believed him. And because he had a very well-known practice in Vienna. And so what happened was he was telling people, I can cure you. And he would put on this big show of putting magnets on the body part that they were complaining about. So if they had a sore throat, he put the magnet on the throat and the person would start to feel better, which is where the placebo effect comes in. He saw them putting the magnet on. They felt it. They were told by a medical doctor this is going to work. And so they did report feeling better. But I think he kind of showed his hand in that he knew the magnets weren't doing anything, because he eventually phased the magnets completely out of his treatment and just started using his hands and waving his hands over his patients, and claimed that he was moving magnets without actually using the magnets anymore, which to me says, like, you knew this wasn't a thing. But it actually enhanced the effect that he had on the patients, because they saw him doing this very dramatic theatrical act, and they would report feeling better. And so he practiced in Vienna and got very famous, but he made a mistake and told a famous pianist that he could cure her blindness, which he could not, but she paid him very handsomely to try. And it sort of became clear to the other medical people that he was scamming people. This isn't what we taught. And he's claiming to be a medical doctor from the University of Vienna, and he's scamming these people. So he got literally ran out of town, which should also give you an idea of the sentiment at the time. You know, people hated this guy when they found out what he was doing. And the other kind of seedy thing with him is that he would touch the people that he was working on, which were all usually women, and he would touch them in places that you would not touch a woman, especially during that time, like on their stomach and on their thigh. And so when people found out about this, they felt very protective of the women in their community and felt that he needed to be ran out of town. So then he moved to Paris and did the exact same thing. And the end of the story is that it all culminates in what ends up being one of the first psychological experiments ever done. And one of those fun facts is that the committee that ran this experiment in order to discredit Mesmer formally with science was Benjamin Franklin, because that's just a fun fact. So this committee...
he was an ambassador to France for a long time.
Yeah. So Benjamin Franklin discredited this guy by doing an experiment where they, basically proved the placebo effect, where if people thought that they got the magnet treatment, they reported feeling better. If they actually got the magnet treatment, they reported feeling better. If they got neither, they didn't feel any better. And so they were able to prove this with science, that this wasn't real. And it's kind of the reason psychology is how it is today, where you have to do something that's evidence-based. And if you're not doing something that's evidence-based, you could go to jail. So the impact that he had on psychology was basically out of spite. People needed to have proof that this didn't work, because you can't prove something that wasn't real. You can't say that they didn't actually feel different, because they genuinely did. The placebo effect is real. It has an effect. And if there was any hypnotic effect as well, the experience would be twofold. And the kind of one thing, and this was something that one of his students did, but started using hypnosis as a form of anesthesia before surgery, which was big at the time because they did not have good anesthesia back in the day. So hypnosis is real. Some people can get hypnotized. But what this guy was doing was not hypnosis, in my opinion, and was just scamming people out of their money, kind of knowingly just putting on an act and getting famous for it. So he really, I think he died believing that he was a very special magnet person. And he admitted that not everyone could use this power and that only certain people could. And it just gets very into to me, this is where the spiritual leader in science sort of hit in our society for the first time, in Europe. Not sure about, the rest of the world.
Interesting, because that is a time where Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, we are using methods and learning about the natural world in ways that we hadn't for, thousands of years. You could argue the scientific method goes back all the way and starts with Aristotle, right? His deductive reasoning versus Plato's inductive reasoning. But like what you said, 1730 to 1810. So we're right at the cusp of germ theory.
Yes.
Right?
Another
Right
invisible force affecting people.
Right. We're at a point where alchemy is chemistry. And this is something that a lot of people bring up all the time. Okay, not a lot of people, but people are starting to remember and inject back into our cultural historical memory of that time period of the Enlightenment, because we look back and we look at the Enlightenment and we see Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and eventually people like John Stuart Mills and things like that, and we see reason and logic as the foundation principles, and we forget that these people were also thoroughly embedded in spiritual structures. And like, what is alchemy if not the perfect blend of chemistry and the occult, right? And it was the spiritual occult leanings of these people combined with the tools of logic and reason that gave us the major developments through trial and error, oftentimes more error than success through trial, to get to the understandings of where we are today. I mean, just jumping railroad tracks here, but bear with me. Do you know how our first president, George Washington, died?
Peacefully in his orchard.
Unfortunately, no. He had an illness. He was sick, pneumonia, amongst other things. And our first Attorney General of the United States federal government, I forget his name. I could Google it really quickly, but I'm not going to because it's not particularly important. Dr. Whoever gave him a transfusion of goat's blood because Washington's blood was impure, hence why he was sick. And these are the same people that that established the founding principles of the United States, things that we look at as brilliant and genius because they are. These are the same people that worked in circles with Thomas Jefferson, who was a polymath. Say what you want about him as an individual person with his characters and his flaws, doesn't matter. The man was probably one of the smartest people that our country's had. Benjamin Franklin, incredibly brilliant individual. But they were all still in that time period where the differentiation between occult spirituality and science was so blurry you couldn't tell where one stopped and the next one started, right? The people that made our country didn't know that dinosaurs had existed. Like the paleontology and fossils putting together to establish that dinosaurs were creatures and they weren't just a piece of an old animal or something like that, didn't come about until, the mid 1800s. And even then they were horribly wrong, at least as far as our understanding today. But it's easy to look at the founding documents or to read something from Thomas Jefferson and to see his prose and to see his logic play out, or to read something from John Locke and to be like, yes, this dude is brilliant. He totally gets it. And forget that these people were doing this at a time where if you didn't adhere to the local superstitions, you were going to die horribly.
Yeah. That makes me kind of go back to the ethics question, which is I do think that a lot of people will unfairly judge historical figures based on our modern ethics and not based on the ethics of the time, which is why I kind of stress that Mesmer was ran out of town for, exploiting people in his community. Obviously, what he was doing was against the ethics of the time. So I feel no reservation in judging him as a disgraced physician who, did a lot of harm in the world. versus someone who was acting in good faith and who was accepted by their community and didn't do anything wrong that got them ran out of town, and then saying today, like, well, they were horrible, they knew it was wrong, how could they do that? Because number one, that doesn't help anything. It's a boring conversation. And number two, we can't learn. Like, I think what bothers me the most about Mesmer is if he had stopped and said, these magnets aren't doing anything, I should explore this further scientifically. He could have been an incredibly accredited and influential father of psychology by studying how people's mood and brain and suggestion can affect how they interpret what their physical nervous system is telling them. But he chose to make money off of those people and escalate his one of the things that he did during his treatments was he brought in musicians to play music to enhance the experience, which did work. People felt much more compelled, but he really leaned into the theatricality of what he was doing, and he had a chance to discover and improve society and science. And instead, a committee put on by the last king of France was the one who had to prove that, and he really forced their hand into doing it, which is a shame to me. We got there and learned about this. The committee did not end and say the placebo effect is real. That was much later, but it's kind of the first documented time that we see that, and got us started. It was the first psychological experiment. It was the first time we had to sit down, and it was to prove someone wrong who was using their influence and their prestige to influence people in a way that we didn't fully understand because we didn't have any grasp of psychology. And that is, having to do that reactively, I feel like is sad. It would have been cool if it was done in earnest and actual curiosity for the human experience.
Yeah, the fallacy that you bring up there about applying modern moral structures to historical events is called presentism or presentivism. And it's something that we have to keep an eye out for as historians, because it's really easy to look back 500 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago and say those people were absolutely terrible. And that glosses over the intricate and complex sociocultural environments that those people were embedded in, right? Speaking of messing with forces that we don't understand, my last guy that I chose is Grigori Rasputin.
Yeah. I feel like he is the example for this whole archetype.
He is such an enigma and so multi-layered and multifaceted in so many different ways. Like, I don't think there's enough time in one human lifetime to understand this person, right? He was born a peasant in Siberia, which, being a peasant is tough. Being in Siberia is tough. Put the two together, right? You'd have to imagine hearty stock in order to survive or thrive in those conditions. He, from a young age, was different, felt different, and yearned for meaning and special purpose, and all of the characteristic traits that we've looked at in all of the people that we've discussed so far. He made a few holy expeditions. Let me back up. As a teenager, he got into a lot of trouble with the local authorities, and had to make a pilgrimage to whatever Russian Orthodox ministry was sufficiently far enough away and important enough for him to make a pilgrimage to. I'm not even going to bother with any of the names because I'm going to butcher them because I don't do Russian very well. And along the way in doing so, that's when he started having his, we'll call them divine inspirations. He was a devout Orthodox Christian. But he manipulated the boundaries. Manipulated might be too harsh. He massaged the boundaries of. Well, he didn't start a cult. He was investigated by the Orthodox Church numerous times. And every single time they came back and said, yeah, he's doing things a little wonky, but he's devout. He observes the fasting days. He observes communion. He observes this, that, and the third. He's not one of the heretical sects. There was a specific one in Russia at the time that was very much Aleister Crowley style, orgiatic meetings and specific chants and things like that as like those shortcuts to that divine inspiration. And he was acquitted of those charges every single time. But he was close. He had his quote unquote secret meetings at his houses and stuff like that. He had his entourage of female followers that would often, visit him at the bathhouse. Sometimes it was benign and they were just there helping wash his feet or whatever. Other times it wasn't. There's anecdotal stories from his wife where his wife is giving tours around the town for visitors and they bump into him having sex with another local woman. And his wife is like, that's just his cross to bear. Right. Very similar to that Aleister Crowley style, do what thou wilt. But Rasputin's flavor was more of a Christianity is based on repentance, which means if you don't do anything wrong, you can't adhere to the patterns of behavior of repentance. Right.
That's
so it's
very
not
convenient.
Right. Which begs the question, is that self-serving for his addictions to alcohol and intercourse? Or was it legitimately that he honestly felt like he didn't want to, but it was part of the Lord setting the stage for him to be the type of person that needed to repent in order to be the model to help show his followers how to embody repentance? And I think the answer to both of those is yes, because if he believes it, right, it goes back to the kind of Harry Potter thing. If he believes it and does those things to model repentance, and then other people are getting benefit out of it, then, I mean, who's to say? I have a couple examples of that mindset that he has. The first one is, and this is a book by John Fuhrmann, mispronouncing the name. I have it, my highlights pulled up on the Kindle, so I can't look at who the author is right now. But the book is titled Rasputin, the Untold Story. And the first quote that I have is from page 33. It says, quote, "Suffering brought redemption and grace, and to complain about misfortune was to question the very order of the universe," end quote. Now, I can imagine that a poor peasant, he didn't die poor. He wasn't rich by any means, but he was wealthy and well off. So in some degree, he made it work for him. But at least being born poor, a poor peasant in feudal Russia, in Siberia, you kind of have to have that attitude of, this is the way it is. Bitching about it doesn't change anything. But that whole suffering brought redemption and grace, and to complain about misfortune was to question the very order of the universe. Had either Rasputin or his wife complained about their quote-unquote cross to bear, doing so, there's the balloons again, doing so would be blasphemous in a sense, because that would be questioning the divine ordering of things, right?
That's very interesting, because that's kind of the opposite, or just like thinking of Russia, the first thing to me that comes to mind is like the revolts that, you know, complaining got them somewhere eventually. And that seems like the exact opposite sentiment coming from him, which is like, just take it, take the hurt, you know, take the winters. There's nothing you can do about it. You're going to be a peasant forever, up until the point where, you know, a large group of them decided, no, we will not.
Right. But I think too that
do you think that was like purposely contrarian of him for like his community saying like, we could do something? Or, you know, do you feel like that was a reaction to like revolution sentiment, or kind of his own thing that he just came up with to cope?
Well, here's what I'll say, because at least in Russia at this time, the head of state was the head of church. Right. And that definitely sounds like an attitude that you want to push on the people that you expect to be subservient. Hey man, times are going to be hard sometimes. I'm still going to be eating well in the castle, but, you know, we all have our cross to bear. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, empty is the belly that farms the field, right? But I think going a little bit farther into Rasputin himself, I got another quote here, because like 3 of his first children died young. A lot of his siblings died young. And the next quote is, quote, "The pattern of high infant mortality was an accepted part of life in Siberia, and Rasputin apparently never spoke of his losses. Such deaths were simply manifestations of God's inexplicable will." You're going to have this.
Fair enough.
Right. You're going to have.
It's a well-earned sentiment then. Yeah.
And on top of that too, like, it's not just the hardships of you go hungry, or you're overtaxed, or your kid dies young, or, you know, your baby dies in childbirth or something like that. But if we keep that do what thou wilt mentality with it as well, like, yeah, we know that being a raging drunkard that is probably one of the most adulterous people that I've ever read about ever is a bad thing. But if that's your cross to bear, if those were simply manifestations of God's inexplicable will to give you something to redeem yourself for, it would be selfish and blasphemous of you to try and be a better person and not do those things. Right? Not advocating like, hey, everybody, go do whatever you want to. It's just going to be your way to become a better person because you have a cross to bear now. But if we're trying to psychoanalyze it from his perspective, like, yeah, there is the self-serving, I get to do what I want to and I don't have to feel bad about it. And my wife, I found a good woman, she's still going to be loyal to me, however we negotiate that loyalty means, and whatever. But there could also be that if you're someone that believes that you are special and have a mission to lead ecclesiastical affairs in some capacity, because he used his influence with the Tsar to manipulate bishopries in the Orthodox Church in Russia. He positioned people that would more or less agree with him, or that he more or less agreed with, that under normal conditions would be ineligible for the job because of ordinary non-noble birth status, to be bishops and archbishops in the Russian Orthodox Church. Like, he was playing out the beliefs that he was meant to help organize the spirituality of the people he came in contact with to be something different. And not different as in like not Russian Orthodox anymore, but to be their spiritual leader in a sense. Then, you know, you can see the rationalization behind it as more than just a, this suits me and I get away with what I want. It is that. And then more too.
This makes me think, or something that kind of came up while I was thinking about Mesmer, was the uses of hypnosis. And this is going to tie in, but you can, you know, it is a real phenomenon. It's something that you can actually do. And I suspect that the way that Rasputin dealt with the problem of hemophilia for the Tsar's family. What was the name of the child? Alex or something?
Alexis or Alexei.
Alexis. Yeah. He most likely used hypnosis in order to calm the child down, which, being stressed out, makes hemophilia worse. So removing that stress with hypnosis is a valid treatment option, especially for the resources that they had at the time. And, you know, you can still use hypnosis today. There's a lot better anesthetics to use today, so I probably wouldn't recommend it for anesthesia, but it is like most commonly used to like treat smoking cessation, or to, you know, and only certain people can get hypnotized. It doesn't work for everyone. But the, you know, this was probably like a legitimate actual physiological change that he was having on that child, because he was probably using hypnosis, probably without knowing it. But, you know, he was very good at it. He could do it consistently. He could do it on command. So to me, that reads as like he was actually doing something, because you had enough times, you had a big enough sample that, you know, when he was there, the bleeding stopped. When he wasn't there, the bleeding kept going. So the it would be hard to discredit someone who genuinely was having an effect, and he was not just talking nonsense or claiming that magnets were changing things. And, you know, I'm not sure exactly what his claims were, but from what I understand, he claimed that when he needed to talk to Alexei, and that made him better, which was probably actually true. So it would be really tough to say, you know, this person is scamming you, this person is doing something wrong, when he's kind of actually right. It's just using parts of, you know, human suggestion that we don't really understand. So you know,
and
he wasn't
on
lying
top
to
of
them.
that too, we have to keep in mind the social implications. So there's another anecdotal piece of evidence I want to bring up, and then we can talk about the social implications. But the story goes thusly, that Rasputin was in St. Petersburg, and he was doing his Rasputin-y things, and the Tsar and Tsarina, Nicholas and Alexandra, got tired of him and was like, hey, you're causing too much controversy in the court, and they sent him away. And they sent him away to Siberia, and they went to take a vacation at their winter palace or whatever, which, you know, must be really difficult for them to go vacation at their winter palace. But, you know, while they're there, they're doing stuff, and they go on a boat ride, and Alexei jumped in the boat and, you know, got an internal bruise and had a hard time of it. couple days at the Winter Palace, he's in excruciating pain because, internal hemorrhaging and things like that. And then, so they leave and they come back to St. Petersburg. And for whatever reason, he starts mending. And the Tsarina thinks it's a good idea to take him on a carriage ride through town, get some fresh air. And they hit a bump and he regresses, and just like quality of life absolutely just nosedives, right? The physicians are examining him. His pain is so bad that the staff has to wear cotton in their ears to not have his screams drive them insane. Nicholas II and Alexandra are taking turns at his bedside. They have last will and testaments drawn up. They perform last rites on him, and they prepare the statement for the public for his death, because for all accounts and all signs point that he has internal bleeding and hemorrhaging. They can't stop it, and he's showing all of the medical signs that he's going to die in the next couple days, next day or two. As a last-ditched effort, Alexandra writes by wire, so telegram, to Rasputin in Siberia, explaining the situation to him. Is there anything you can do? And he replies back, I'm going to paraphrase it, but something along the lines of, God has heard you. Your boy will be fine. Don't let the doctors mess with him anymore. The next day, Alexei's fever breaks. He gets a good night's sleep and he starts recovering. So,
again, considering your previous goat blood anecdote with, giving the former president blood poisoning on purpose,
right.
He might not have been wrong.
That was, 150 years prior. We're talking 1914 at this point, 1915 maybe. But it doesn't matter. Like, that one very well could have just been coincidence, right? A podcast I listened to, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, was talking about it. He's got a really long, 50-hour segment on World War I, and one of the parts he talks about is the Rasputin story. And we know, aspirin is really big as a miracle drug at this time, right? Just been recently invented and mass produced. And we know that aspirin, to do its job to relieve pain, thins your blood. So if he's in pain and the doctors are giving him aspirin and it's thinning his blood and he already has hemophilia, then it's just exacerbating the problem. So the doctors quit messing with him, stop giving him aspirin. Within 24 hours, his blood isn't as thin as it would be with the aspirin, and he starts recovering, which there is.
Yeah, so he was right.
Right. So there's some possible truth to that. Now, as far as social implications, if you are Nicholas II and Alexandra and you have a hemophilic son, the only son that you have, the heir to the throne, and on multiple occasions you have seen this quirky, adulterous, holy man heal his ailments, and on command, he can heal your son by telegram from 1,000 miles away. Wouldn't you keep him close by too? Going back to what we were talking about earlier, if we had to make a decision in our country that would benefit us for 50 or 100 years, but we knew 400 years from now would be twice as bad, Rasputin was part of the reason why the royal family and the institution of the Tsarist regime was alienated from the people, and it's a reason why he was assassinated. But also at the same time, looking at it from the human perspective, could we expect them to have chosen any differently? And I think that answer is no.
Yeah, I think I can't remember exactly, but untreated, the average lifespan of someone with hemophilia is 18. And so the child, I could look up exactly what that is, but anyways, he wasn't old enough to have exceeded his expected lifespan. So he, Rasputin did not like defy science or medicine or, do anything that was particularly extraordinary as far as the treatment of hemophilia. Obviously, we do not hypnotize the patients today. So,
no,
not a
but
treatment,
we also have treatments today. They didn't quite necessarily have treatments then.
Exactly. Yeah. Today you get like gene therapy, and then you take a couple of like types of blood medication, and then you get infusions of other people's blood products that, we can basically fix it. If someone has hemophilia, they have it, but they can completely treat it. And
they're medicalized for life, but they can live
symptom
life.
Free.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really do empathize with this couple, because what he was doing and suggesting was probably having an actual tangible effect, and kind of regardless of whether or not this you liked him or not, it's obvious that I think that they were using all of the facts. He wasn't hypnotizing the parents or anything. Like, there wasn't, some people claim that Rasputin had some type of mystic power that was affecting. I think that he was just observant and knew. He said things that could not be disproven given the tools that they had at the time. And it was just impossible to get rid of him, because everything he said was technically completely true and repeatable.
And I think, if we're going to go that route, I think the term for it is cold reading, right? It's the thing like the people that do the I'm Talking to Your Dead Ancestors TV shows do, right? It's a skill. Throw out generic statements and they read the room to see who's going to bite. And then they keep with the generic statements until they can pinpoint and add just enough specificity to make you feel like they've randomly picked something out of the air when it's not true. And I think he was just eccentric enough to where a lot of his oddities could be passed off as just the type of behaviors that you expect from celebrities, right? He gets too drunk at parties and goes to the restaurant and gets naked in the middle and puts his genitals on the table of the royal duchess that's visiting or whatever, and all the nobles laugh at it because isn't he just outrageous? He doesn't know better. He's just a little peasant. He's trying to keep up with us. And I got thumbs up on my screen for that. So apparently I'm right, But at the same time, it would be one thing if he was just meandering through the world, handling his own affairs. It's another thing entirely when he's dictating the order of the holy arbiters of the church. It's another thing entirely when Nicholas II goes to the front lines and Rasputin is influencing Tsarist regime policy. Like, even the British secret services were keeping an eye on him because of his influence over the royal family. They had a code name for him. Rasputin's code name in the British intelligence circles was Dark Forces.
Very eerie.
Right. And that doesn't do anything to eliminate the mystique of him today as we're looking back in history to try and understand who he is. But even then, you can look at pictures of this guy. And granted, the old grainy black and white film photos of the early 1900s have way more detail than our digital photography has today, right? But even just pictures of him, like, you can see that piercing quality of his eyes, like he's looking into your soul. And that's not just because we have that bias of all of this popular culture that's built up around him. That's what the people at the time, his contemporaries, said about him. He would walk in the room, and if he looked at you, you knew it. You could feel him. Now, maybe that was just because he was intuitive at reading people, and he didn't know how to hide his body language that he was reading people. Or it might just, I mean, I'm not going to say he had any supernatural powers or anything like that. I'm just listing the characteristics of him that people recognized that allowed him to get into the position that he did, to influence the people that he did the ways that he did. Right.
Yeah, I think
he was an enigma.
I have more respect for Rasputin because he did what he said he did what was on the tin. I'm a spiritual religious leader. He didn't make any claims about having medical knowledge or that he had a special treatment that he could use. I think he was as ethical as he could be with his world perspective, and for the time was not unethical with the way that he presented himself and the things that he actually did.
Right.
Because
you got what you paid for and you knew what you were paying for.
Yeah. So he didn't misrepresent himself for what he was doing. He said, I'm going to use my connection with my deity and I'm going to talk to the kid and he's going to get better. And that's what he did. So I have, I think that's why he persists and is so interesting, because you can't say he was a liar. He was a scammer. I mean, you can, but you can't prove that he was a liar or a scammer, that he knew what he was doing or that he had bad intentions, because I think exactly what you said when you started his little biography, which is he walked the line consistently. And to this day, you can interpret him as, an unethical scammer or a, righteous holy man who, no one could possibly have stopped the fall of that family. And so the fact that he couldn't and, appeared to have a negative influence, it was going downhill anyways. So
yeah, and
some people do blame him for the fall.
Because he definitely had he might not have been the main character in that story.
Right.
But he was a character in that story, and that story would have been different had he not been playing his character. He was so influential, at least in his own ways there, that he was poisoned, shot, and drowned just to make sure. Like, the story goes, and I read an academic journal article exploring how Rasputin could have survived his cyanide poisoning from a pharmacological perspective. And it was particularly interesting. Apparently there's a specific chemical that can be found in garlic that is a natural, not an antidote, but it decreases the prevalence of the primary chemical in cyanide. Right? So if you have cyanide and you're just a, Siberian peasant that likes a lot of garlic with your food, then if you're eating a bunch of raw or fresh garlic, you would, in theory, have a higher tolerance or at the very least lethal threshold for cyanide poisoning than the average Joe would, which is why in the story when Prince Yusuf, forget his name, and it's late, so we're just going to power through. The nobleman that invited him down to have dinner and sleep with his wife fed him wine and food laced with cyanide. The only thing Rasputin complained about was that his throat's getting a little itchy. Can I have some more wine? It's getting a little hard to breathe because my throat's itchy. The dude freaks out, and so he goes upstairs with the conspirators and talks with them, and comes back down, and then positions himself in such a way as to shoot Rasputin. And then he goes upstairs, and then they come back down again just to have one final look because they don't feel really good about it. And then apparently Rasputin gets up foaming at the mouth and just like zombie apocalypse style rushes arms out at the dude that shot him, and then manages to run up the stairs and try and get out, and so he gets shot like 2 or 3 more times, including in the forehead, and then they bind him and throw him into the river, and then 2 or 3 days later he's found in the river. And legend holds that the autopsy said he had water in his lungs and he was halfway unbound, suggesting that you poisoned him and it didn't get him. You shot him and it didn't do the trick. You threw him in an icy river bound up and it almost didn't work because like he had to be respirating in order to have water in his lungs. I've read something somewhere that the autopsy report was reread with a fine-tooth comb after the fall of the Soviet Union. And, so that's controversial whether he actually had water in his lungs or not. But isn't it just wonderful to add to the story of Rasputin that like he almost made it out of the river too, to add icing on the cake? And then we can kind of end with this. Supposedly a few days before, because news of his assassination attempt wasn't too secret. His family knew about it. He knew that there was plots that harm was going to come to him. He knew he wasn't safe. Apparently, legend holds that a few days before, he made a note or mention to the Tsar and Tsarina that if I am killed or expelled from your court, your family will die and your regime will topple. And by God, if that ain't exactly what happened.
That is what happened. My question about the autopsy would be, does ingesting a lot of cyanide cause your lungs to secrete fluid? Because I would assume if there was fluid in his lungs, it probably came from the cells degrading. I don't know how cyanide works, but I imagine it's rough on the whole body.
I'm not a pharmacologist, so...
Yeah, those things in isolation are very cool. When you put the entire context, which you're obviously not able to now, but I imagine the entire context would almost makes it even more miraculous to me, because if a person who has special powers is using their special powers to influence, that's kind of boring. Like, okay, that's not a very cool explanation for what happened. But a person who, by coincidence, hates aspirin and doctors and is making all of these right choices in a row and feeding off of his own hype just enough not to topple too far into something that is, could be disproven, doesn't make any claims that are too far out there to get him excommunicated, or whatever the Russian Orthodox version of excommunicated is. He, towing that line the whole way, I think is more interesting and more miraculous than someone who had some type of prescient idea of what was going to happen. Calling all of those shots and being right is cool. It's like gambling. And he, it's like going down a slot machine and hitting the jackpot on every single one in a casino. That's really cool.
Right. And I wouldn't want to be related to him. I wouldn't want him as a father or a brother or a best friend. I wouldn't want to hang out with him. But my God, his story is just wonderful, isn't it?
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah. He is I could watch a movie about him once a month and not get bored with it. He's fascinating.
Yeah. There's not any story that's quite like his, as far of no matter what perspective you take, you're like, wow.
And I think we could have a lot more of those if we had more historical data from farther back in time.
Right. People calling shots and being right on accident.
Yeah. And I think he's just one of those where the technology hadn't caught up enough to premeditatively intervene, right? Because we have spyware now and we have authentication and all of these things. Good luck trying to get out and beat the system, because we don't even know how the system works because we're just plebeians.
It's true. I can't build a website anymore. It's too complicated.
But technology at his time had caught up enough to where we have a detailed enough account to more or less know what happened. But there's just enough error to where we don't know what happened. But we have
Can't explain it. Yeah.
Right. But we have a wealth of information that we can paint enough of a picture. And he was at a point in time where he could wing it through these pivotal decision-making processes to get to where he did that would be impossible now. Like, if you were to happen to make best friends with someone who knew someone who knew someone that was in charge of the Anglican Church that could get you a seat at a dinner with the royal family right now, and that sparked a chain of events where 4 times a year for the next 6 years, you could plant little bugs in their ears and heal one of their kids when they got sick. Like, that is impossible to happen today. It would never happen, you know. But
Yeah.
he lived at a time where that was possible. And I don't know. I'm not a big proponent of fate or destiny, because I think we are allowed to make our own decisions in some capacity, and our story's not pre-written, right? If we have a fate or a destiny, then that means by definition at least some of the story's already pre-written. But given the amount of infinitely small margin of error for his story to play out the way that it did, kind of makes you wonder.
The guiding hand versus this was inevitable because of these, it is fascinating. And I do think, looking back, we will be able to see some coincidences, but I feel like that, you know, today, trying to think of contemporaries who you could say had, you know, really stumbled into something miraculous. The only one I can think of is Louis Pasteur, who had like 7 different world-changing inventions in his lifetime. But he, you know, that's all explainable because he knew, actually, he didn't even really know what he was, you know, right on germ theory. And Louis Pasteur isn't even contemporary, but I feel like we are able to explain, and we can over-explain every phenomenon. This is why the volcano exploded. This is why this town had crazy flooding. And there's not enough room for like, that was weird, because everything has an explanation, which so yeah, I would wonder if it is even possible because of how much information and science we sort of anxiously and instinctively throw on things that, you know, people are experts in basically every category of the world at this point. So there would always be someone who could say, actually.
And to wrap this up with a nice, pretty little bow, because it's been a long episode so far.
Oh yeah.
And we do need to kind of wrap up, but the over-explaining that you mentioned, when we reverse the clock and we go back to the times where we're not able to over-explain, that creates the perfect vacuum for the mystic influencing, I was going to say mystic man, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, was one of those spiritual mystic influencers, so to speak. But we'll call it the mystic influencer, able to fill that void. If you can read the portents and the signs in such a way as to be semi-reliable, you're making decisions and people are listening to you. You just have to be right more often than you're wrong. On your wrong, you can be like, oh, well, you know, the gods were fickle because you woke up on the wrong side of the bed that day.
Right. Like know what to make a statement about and what to be vague about and what to, absolutely rail against, with whatever knowledge they had at the time to go on. And also luck, which I know, the idea that things are accidents we kind of touched on as well can be cause a lot of insecurity and fear and anxiety, that everything is an accident. And so having the explanation for what is going on, having the answers is very human. So even if they don't exist in the same capacity, they definitely do still exist. And, maybe with my modern perspective, I'm not able to pick out the people in our world right now who are acting as those guides, but it probably will be scientists.
And then that brings us full circle to where we had the scientific revolution enmeshed in the Enlightenment. I mean, like Isaac Newton went to church consistently, right? He was trying to find ways to mathematically explain his spiritual beliefs, and he gave us calculus. And now we're going to get back to a position where the mysteries of the universe are explained to us through the spiritual medium of science. If that ain't irony, I don't know what is.
I love it, because that makes me comfortable and happy and secure, and it takes away my anxiety. So the effect is the same.
Yeah, it does the opposite for me, because we know human nature and people have agendas, and not to get too postmodern with it, but Michel Foucault called it the technocracy, where we're going to have a global society of people that have to rely on these systems experts to run the systems for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that means we're basically moving back to a feudal system, but instead of work the land, you peasants, it's going to be pay the taxes, you factory workers. Because we don't know how to fix the phones that we use. We don't know how to fix the internet networks that we use. We don't know how to fix the electronics that we use. We don't know any of the intricacies of any of the higher level science that is necessary in order to explain away the things that are happening, or to explain why they need to happen differently. And then we have unattainable college prices and other forms of gatekeeping that are keeping people out unless you adhere to the specific sets of agendas in order to do the things, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, I do like that over specialization perspective, because I feel like there's been a current movement moving away from like going and getting a college degree. You must become an expert in something in order to make it in the world. It would be nice to see that go away a little bit. Although I enjoy my passion. I enjoyed college. I really liked it. I know a lot of people who hated every second of college, and they regret their student loans and don't use their degree at all and aren't interested in the subject, and feel bad for them. Didn't have to be that way. Well, great episode.
Yeah, I think we're good. Go team. On to the next one.